Hello! Today I'm taking a look at The Lighthouse, an uncomfortable and immersive visual spectacle that ranks among my favourite movie experiences of recent years. Now, a lot of discussion of the film has hinged around how it fits into the fledgling oeuvre of Robert Eggers and his growing repute as a director of unsettling, vaguely fantastical horror films. But rather than discussing the film in these terms and as a genre piece, I actually found the designation of horror film for The Lighthouse slightly inconvenient, perhaps because it put off some of my friends, so I ended up watching it alone in a completely empty cinema, which was actually pretty cool. But more so because now having watched the film, at face value, the catch-all classification of horror, or even psychological horror, doesn't account for the hugely comic aspects of the film, and what is essentially a pair of versatile character studies, I'd say, that just happen to be set in this uneasy Lovecraftian setting. And I actually think it would appeal to a lot more people that may have been, put off by the classification of a horror film. But that said, of course, the beauty of this film is how the sinister Lovecraftian elements inch their way into the characters over the course of the film. And as things unravel, in many ways, the lighthouse and the forbidding elements of the wind and the sea comprise this additional character, and there's a sort of malicious sentience that imposes itself on the events as they unfold, and I'll touch on this shortly. So, over the course of this episode, I'll touch on the themes, the character, and the story of the lighthouse, which all, to some degree, interrelate and come together to craft a masterpiece out of what is essentially two men dialoguing in a lighthouse. But I want to kick off first with the visual style and the aesthetic arrangement of the film, which for many, including myself, was the intriguing hook through which this film became so appealing in the first place. And I think, irrespective of the layered interpretable story and the stellar performances by Patterson and Dafoe, the film can be appreciated as a visual spectacle in its own right. And the composition of the shots, the framing, the lighting, and everything that comprises the cinematography was beautifully done, and was not merely a vehicle for telling the story, but as much a part of the fabric of the piece, as the costume, the period vernacular, and the rugged setting. Indeed, as Marshall McLuhan famously wrote, the medium is the message, and in the spirit of that, I think the way the film was shot, characterises and synchronises so much with what is being shot and the content of the piece. And in conjunction with the sound design and the music score, this film is all-encompassing, and it's something that can, it must be experienced rather than simply being watched. Looking at some specific examples, the squared frame and monochromatic film stock of The Lighthouse are the most obvious distinctions of the film that conjure ideas of 19th and early 20th century image making. Within this, we have the periodic use of soft focus and blurring in the surrealist reprieves, which is very similar to the pictorialist photography movement of the 19th century, which was renowned for using soft focus to add a dreamlike quality to their images, which often depicted scenes from fairy tales, folklore, and so on. Additionally, the camera filtering used in the film and the resulting tonal qualities and style also arguably has roots in pictorialism, as the photographer turned cinematographer Karl Struss was responsible for several lens filtering experiments and innovations at the turn of the century that he brought from pictorialism into the motion picture industry. And The Lighthouse brilliantly adopts these throughout the film to inform the aesthetic. And for example, the red tones have been stripped out of the film, giving the skin this dark, weathered quality to it. But at certain intervals, we can see that the filters have actually been switched up in order to alter the mood and the meaning. And for example, the mermaid skin is this radiant white. So the traditional techniques and the use of filtering was really well done in this film, I think, and adds so much weight to the atmosphere and the mood. I also love the use of light and contrast, which in many ways nods to the expressionist films of the 1920s, such as The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and Nosferatu, which brilliantly crafted horror and foreshadowing through shadows and highlights. And I'm sure that we're all familiar with Nosferatu's creeping shadow on the wall, as it's among the most enduring cinematic images of this period. And while I'm loath to call The Lighthouse a horror film, I think it certainly adopted some of the mise en scene from this movement and this particular genre in some places. Beyond this, and a very final point on the filming, I think The Lighthouse inches beyond the 19th century and early horror films to dwell firmly in the Freudian, dreamscape-inspired films of the Surrealist movement. And the Surrealists, of course, relied heavily on montage, collage, and psychoanalytic metaphors to a massive degree. And a popular example would be Luis Buñuel's film, The Andalusian Dog, from 1929. And this makes metaphorical transitions between analogous shapes. And there's a famous sequence of a woman's eyeball getting sliced by a razor, which promptly transitions to an image of a sliver of cloud cutting across a full moon. And this sort of visual metaphoring is exactly the sort of territory that The Lighthouse dwells in, such as the rather tense masturbation sequence, where Winslow's desperate bashing is interspersed by thrusting phallic symbols, such as tentacles, nautical instruments, and lighthouse mechanisms. Not to mention the shot of the lighthouse flipping 180 degrees to sort of symbolise an erection. And so I think the use of symbolism in these reprieves offers a very obvious yet very well executed visual clarity to what's going on, or at least what's being felt by our characters. So while I could go on about the style of this film, because I love the cinematography and every frame of it is just brilliant in my opinion, I want to move on and discuss the characters and the story now, because, as I mentioned earlier, The Lighthouse could very much be considered a pair of character studies more than anything else, as most of the events hinge around and most of the story emerges out of this tumultuous relationship between Wake, the old guy, and Winslow, the young guy. Now, I've mentioned the idea of the odd couple dynamic in the past, and this is a narrative device that's often used in theatre, film, and various media to craft comedy, dilemma, and personality out of a pair of characters in certain situations. And it's generally based on two very different, often polarised characters that are thrown together by some circumstance that they have to navigate through. Great examples of this in theatre are Samuel Beckett's play, Waiting for Godot, and Tom Stoppard's play, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are Dead, because much like The Lighthouse, these two plays use the contrariness of the two central figures to elicit both comedy and more thought-provoking ideas through dialogue. And it's no accident that all three have since been incessantly analysed and deconstructed along Freudian, Jungian, and existentialist lines. Such is the potential for the meta-dialogues to be found in these ambiguous and interpretable exchanges between the two characters. Another common element found in stories centred on the odd couple is the absence of a female. And it's notable that in these phallocentric odd couple tragic comedies, chaos often ensues without the mediating force or the counterbalance of a female presence. And I can't help but think of the Samuel Johnson quote that prefixes Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas: "He who makes a beast of himself gets rid of the pain of being a man," which quite aptly denotes this idea, of a male trying to navigate himself. And of course, Fear and Loathing is itself an example of an odd couple film that takes a very primal turn into aggression and destructive chemical escapism as the events unfold, with the one or two fleeting appearances of a female being the target of latent sexual aggression, much like how the mermaid represents a certain repressed sexual appetite in Winslow in The Lighthouse. Another odd couple film we could draw comparisons to is Bruce Robinson's 1987 comedy Withnail and I, and this ranks among one of my favourite films for the same reasons I love The Lighthouse, owing to the quality of the writing and in particular the humorous dialogue exchanges between the two central characters. And in both The Lighthouse and Withnail and I, we see events gradually devolve to a certain primal escapist desire to get as wasted as possible, at the mercy of the elements. But what both films also do, somewhat overtly, is explore a strange and increasingly obscured line between platonic and homoerotic. And in both instances, we find our protagonists acting increasingly like an old married couple, culminating in an awkward and confused embrace. Although in Withnail and I, it's with the overtly homosexual third character of Monty who sort of forces himself onto events. And in The Lighthouse, it's an equally awkward embrace between the two central figures that is broken off and converts immediately to a violent pugilism. And I loved the fluidity of that scene between Wake and Winslow, because it shows how, on a very primal level, sex and violence is muddled together in this soup of testosterone. And while it's usually repressed and appropriately channeled, the isolation and the social dislocation of The Lighthouse has led to this absurdity and crisis of masculinity between the two men. And this psychological battle ensues between maintaining a social order and patriarchal hierarchy against the base desire to penetrate something. And this leads me on to the final point about how the odd couple dynamic is used to effect in The Lighthouse. And though it's a device I've always enjoyed, as I say, I've never before viewed the odd couple in terms of a power struggle or an alpha-beta relationship before. But that's precisely how The Lighthouse uses it, and friction is crafted between these characters through the binaries and the struggle for dominance versus submission. And the enduring focal point of this dominance is access to the ominous light at the top of the tower. To this end, it's initially established that the veteran lighthouse keeper Thomas Wake is in control. He has access to the light and is deeply covetous about his authority over it. He also orders the rookie Winslow around, constantly mocking him and reprimanding him, forcing alcohol upon him. And one of the enduring theories of the film, that I'll touch on shortly, is to what extent Wake is manipulating the situation and gaslighting Winslow into this state of disorientation and progressive insanity, versus any potential supernatural elements, introduced by the seagull, the sea, the light, and so on. But returning to this theme of control, it's interesting to note that for all his early dominance, the tide gradually turns on Wake, and after this brief instance of amicability and even a meshing and muddling of their respective identities, by the end, when we're in the depths of this insanity, we have Winslow leading Wake by a leash, like a dog, across the island, and once again has strong connotations of dominance and submission, young supplanting the old, and several other binaries that we might consider it by. So, moving on, we've established thus far that at its core, The Lighthouse is much like a minimalist play, relying on two characters to discourse and fraternise to propel the story forwards. But what we have as a third character, as it were, is the backdrop of these imposing and potentially supernatural elements: the sea, the wind, the seagull, and of course the lighthouse itself. And these contribute to the story by layering it with alternate explanations for things, and the potential for everything to be much more than this human melodrama. For example, the elder wiki, Thomas Wake, frequently abuses Winslow, ordering him around, messing with him, and, for example, chasing him across the island with an axe, only to immediately accuse Winslow of chasing him with the axe, which is a brilliant scene and trucking shot, which reminds me of the closing scene of Francois Truffaut's 400 Blows. Is an absolutely beautiful shot. But in The Lighthouse, we could interpret this as Wake psychologically disarming an already hallucinating Winslow. We also have the excessive drunkenness and quaffing of turpentine as another explanation for the surrealist happenings, as the more they drink, the more unravelled things become. But beyond this, we have the potential for the supernatural, and, for example, a notable turning point in the film is Winslow's killing of the seagull, and where Wake had previously warned him that seabirds contain the souls of dead men, and thus it was bad luck to kill them. After this event, we see the weather turn for the worse, and their boat home fail to arrive, and things begin to drastically unravel and become unsettlingly weird. Within the seagull scenario, it's also notable that the gull has one eye, and the corpse of the former Wiki that Winslow discovers also has one eye, which offers some interpretation and some weight, perhaps, to Thomas Wake's story about the birds containing the souls of dead men. But to read the film in a different way, it does also raise questions about Thomas Wake himself and how the former Wiki might have died. Did he go mad, as Thomas Wake suggests, or did Wake have something to do with it, based on how we've seen him treat Winslow thus far? Additional scenes, such as Wake's monologue calling on Triton and Neptune and archaic sea gods to curse Winslow, and Winslow's confession that he is in fact a murderer on the run, are also pivotal in how we might interpret how and why these supernatural curses and misfortunes might be occurring to the two men. So what this does is open several avenues of discussion and interpretation for the film, and it's certainly a story that opens more doors and offers more questions than it does answers. But in my opinion, that's part of the enjoyment, and much like the work and the short stories of HP Lovecraft, who I mentioned earlier, it really does adopt this penchant for leaving the reader to decide whether the narrator or protagonist is insane, or whether there really are malignant sea creatures and elder things and unseen forces causing things to go wrong. And for anyone that enjoyed The Lighthouse, on that note, I do recommend Lovecraft as a read, particularly the work collected in Necronomicon, which is a great short story collection, and among my favourites of his. So there's some other interpretations that could be touched on, such as the parallels to Greek mythology, the Promethean imagery, the lust for knowledge and truth, and so on. And even, Winslow falling from the lighthouse while he's painting it, which has been another point of intrigue for whether he's going crazy or hit his head or whatever. But the final thing I want to discuss regarding the lighthouse, which I think contributed greatly to the experience of the film, is both the sound design and also the theme and the concept of time, which work in tandem to craft a lot of the shifting atmospherics and psychological unease of the film's in-world chronology. So the concept of time is an interesting one, and while clocks and timekeeping are often taken for granted, The Lighthouse really exploits the importance of time and how essential it is to orientating oneself and one's relationship to the outside world. And although time is just an idea, the film shows how a listless causality and horribly abstract existence ensues without having time as an anchor, to a particular moment and place. And it's no coincidence that time is a source of intrigue among surrealist artworks that look at the abstract and the subconscious, with Salvador Dali's Melted Clocks being, quite a well-known example of that theme. So, looking at the concept of time in The Lighthouse, from the very outset, it's something that's a consideration of both the characters, along with the sound design. Wake and Winslow arrive at the lighthouse to begin their 4-week rotation, and it's very quickly established that for Winslow, the placement is very much a temporary thing, and he's so preoccupied with the time because he wants to just receive his payment and leave. The film's sound design also features a recurring metronome, whether it's the machinery of the lighthouse or the rhythm of the character's speech, all the way through to the ticking clock itself. Even the flatulence and the body clocks of the characters are something that's a recurring motif in the film. Everything has a rhythm to it, maintaining the pace and really conveniently preventing any sort of lull in the action, while we're watching it. And we could even go so far as to say that, the constant sound of the tide in the exterior shots contributes to this overall tick-tock of the film, which gradually manifests to the forefront of the action and actually haunts the characters, and particularly Winslow, as they lose track of the days. Indeed, another enduring monologue from Defoe's Thomas Wake character is when he quizzes Winslow as to how long they've been on watch. 5 weeks, 2 days, he can't recollect. And at this point, the audience is also unsure because so many seismic drinking sessions and hallucinogenic visions of tentacles and mermaids and, monotonous routines have taken place, that the entire chronology of the film has completely skewed and become sort of an abstract nightmare, really. Shortly thereafter, Winslow smashes the clock, and in my opinion, this symbolises his final departure from logic and civilization and reality, because as I've said, time is such a measure of civilization and logic, really, that his breaking of it shows that he's gone completely off kilter. And it's prudent to note that after this scene, the film enters its closing act, which is very feral and animalistic and brutal in nature. So there's plenty of other avenues we could discuss and interpret regarding the film, and so much of it is ambiguous and beautiful and weird, such as the almost orgasmic interactions with the light itself, the light as a metaphor for some sort of meaning and truth and so on. The cinematography, as I say, is significant in how it adds to the unease with these purposefully claustrophobic, closed-in shots in the square frame. And for example, in the bedroom, we have this awkward pillar right in the middle of the room, dividing Wake and Winslow. And in conventional terms, that might be regarded as poor framing and a poor composition. But in this film, it really helps create this unease and disharmony for the audience. So there's a lot going on, and there's just so much to this film that I love. And as I say earlier, it leaves more questions and room for interpretation than it does answers. So I think it's much more than the genre of horror, or even psychological horror might suggest, and is really one of the most unique films that I've seen in the past couple of years, I think. So there we have it, a very brief consideration and discussion of The Lighthouse. If you got this far, thanks very much for listening, and kudos to you. And if you enjoyed the episode, please consider sharing and subscribing, which will keep you updated with my latest posts.